Dr. Bernal, who will address the issue of size integration and international competitiveness, the role of the CSME. Dr. Bernal.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Good afternoon, all. So, Chairman, today I want to raise the question which I think is one which we need to address before we talk about production integration. We need to talk about some of the principal agents which are supposed to undertake this production integration. And it's for that purpose that I want to raise the question of size, integration, and international competitiveness, the corporate dimension. Underlying this issue is my concern that we're building a private sector-led market-driven economy, and therefore firms, and understanding how firms operate, what their motivations are, what are the kinds of environments which are good for them, is a question which we need to address, and I think it has received insufficient attention. In today's world, there really is only one reality, and that reality is the global economy. It may not yet be a seamless economy, but it impinges on all our activities. There's no economic activity, even those for the domestic market, which is not affected by globalization. In the first hour of being awake, eating, dressing, and going to work, you have already been in contact with products from maybe 60 or 70 countries. And no one is immune to the standards of the global economy. In this milieu, all producers, whether for export or the domestic market, whether for goods or services, must be internationally competitive if they are to survive. Therefore, the development issue for the CARICOM region is how do we ensure international competitiveness in our production of goods and services? Given that we are small developing economies, this is acutely important because we are so vulnerable to the global economy. The challenge of development then is how to create an environment which allows firms who are responsible for trade and investment to have a capacity for continually upgrading and renewing their international competitiveness, both in terms of price and quality. This issue has to be addressed, though, in one of the dominant features of the global economy, which is that there are major, I would say enormous differences in size. The issue of size, though, has been addressed in the literature as differences in size of country. But I think that while this is important and relevant, I believe that there's an additional dimension of size which needs to be addressed, and that is the question of differences in size of firms. After all, it is firms and not countries that trade, produce, and invest, and therefore we need to focus our attention on that dimension of size, which is differences in corporate entities in the global economy. Now, why this is important is because it is generally accepted, and there are exceptions to every rule, that small firms are at a disadvantage when they compete against much larger counterparts. They are at a disadvantage because competitiveness is a relative concept. That is, it's not the absolute price or the quality, it is how it compares with the other competitors. And in this regard, it is well established that the smaller the firm, the more disadvantages that it faces. I go on to suggest that in the case of the Caribbean, our firms are so small by global standards that they can no longer be adequately addressed by the conventional categories of small firm or small enterprise. And to try and capture their reality, I have coined a term which I call nano-firms. And I'll explain that a little later. But basically, the nano-firms are not just small by global standards, but because they operate in a context of small economies, they face two sets of disadvantages. They face the disadvantage of being small relative to their global counterparts, but the milieu in which they have to operate also enforces additional disadvantages, and I will enumerate them later. So the proposition is that if the region is to ensure international competitiveness in production of goods and services, then we have to address the question of the firm in this context. I would venture to suggest that, with some exceptions, the larger the firm, the more likely it is, or the better chance it has of overcoming the disadvantages which they face as nano-firms. Therefore, if we are to move CARICOM along the path of international competitiveness, we have to create within CARICOM an environment which allows firms to enlarge and consolidate so they can overcome some of the disadvantages such as diseconomies of scale, and so that they can have a better prospect of survival in the global environment. This is something which I think has not received adequate attention in the integration process, but it is something that can no longer be postponed. Why? Because we are on the threshold of an era of even greater exposure to more intense international competition. We are scheduled to complete the economic partnership agreement with Europe and the much delayed Doha development agenda, and if the FTAA ever comes to fruition, we could all be completing those by the end of 2007. This is going to usher in even more exposure to international competition.